This is the first of our 4 talks we're going to have to commemorate the start of Vatican II in 1962, which was, of course, one of the major sort of events in the Church for the whole of the 20th century. So we've got tonight's talk, which is to put the Council in its context of Church history, etc. We follow this up with another talk that's going to be on one of the dogmatic papers that came out of the Council, which is on the liturgy, then on the Church itself, and then the Church in the modern world. So it gives a good spread as to what Vatican II was all about. We're very pleased tonight to have Michael Walsh here to give us the historical introduction. Michael is a well-known church historian and also media presenter. So without any further ado, I'll pass it on to you, Michael.
Thank you, Kevin. No, before I begin, I think I ought to say that this lecture really ought to have been given by this man, Norman Tanner, who wrote this book, Councils of the Church, A Short History. I haven't exactly plagiarized it, I assure you, but Norman, alas, who taught for many years at Gregorian University on the Councils of the Church and Church History, in fact, did his doctorate at Oxford on the city of Norwich, but that's another question. Anyway, Norman, alas, although he's back in England now, has got Alzheimer's, so instead you get me. Now, in 1963, during the Second Vatican Council, the Melkite Patriarch Maximus IV suggested that there be established a permanent synod of bishops who could advise the Pope and support him in governing the Church. The following year, and claiming to follow the Patriarch's suggestion, but he didn't, Pope Paul VI announced the creation of regular synods, the first of which was to meet in 1967. It did indeed meet, and has continued to meet at roughly 4 yearly intervals, as well as there being in between extraordinary synods and special synods, the latter, the special synods, being devoted to particular areas of the world. However, before the 1967 synod, Peter Hebblethwaite, who some of you may remember, then the editor of the Jesuit magazine, The Month, asked me to write an article explaining what a synod was. This was not an easy task, because synods hadn't often occurred in the Western Church, though they were common enough in the churches of the Byzantine Rite. One of the points I made in the article was that given the number of bishops and others attending, there would be a larger number of voters at the 1967 synod than there had been present at the very important Council of Trent. More bishops present at the synod than at Trent. Why then, did I ask, did it not have the same authority as a council of the Church? And this is a question that still bugs me. The Code of Canon Law, Canon 342 and following, to be precise, the Code of Canon Law is clear. A synod of bishops is called only to assist the Pope and has no legislative function. Ecumenical councils, on the other hand, do have that legislative function up to a point. They are treated in Canon 337 and following. The College of Bishops, it says in 337, exercises its power over the universal Church in solemn form in an ecumenical council. But it adds in Canon 341 that the decrees of an ecumenical council do not oblige unless they are approved by the Roman Pontiff as well as by the Fathers of the Council and promulgated by the Pontiff's direction. To my mind, this means that the distinction between a synod and a council is almost disappearingly small. To add to the confusion, the word synod is actually simply the Greek word for council. And the Synod of Bishops has been more ecumenical in the sense of representing the whole world, which is what ecumenical means, of course, than almost all the councils except Vatican II. This point, that synods in a sense are very ecumenical, is nowadays made quite frequently. In a recent issue of the Vatican-approved Jesuit journal, La Civiltà Cattolica, for instance, an article about Vatican II began like this. Jesuit Father Karl Rahner was one of the first to recognize that the Second Vatican Council had transformed the Western Catholic Church into a world church. For the first time, a worldwide council with a worldwide episcopate came into existence and functioned independently. Bishops from non-Western countries were certainly present at Vatican I in 1870. But they were largely missionary bishops of European and North American origin. At Vatican II, the bishops came from 116 countries, most of them native-born. 36% from Europe, 23% from Latin America, 12% from North America, and 20% from Asia. And there were also present 10% of bishops came from Africa. By the time of the 1985 Extraordinary Synod of Bishops in Rome, 74% of the bishops came from countries other than Western Europe or North America. Also, more than 70% of the world's Catholics today, that is representing more than 70% of the world's Catholics today. I'm sorry, my glasses are all steamed up, I can't read this properly. That's better. And in a recent book from Trent to Vatican II, one of the contributors pointed out the fact that about 300 Latin American bishops attended the council, compared with a total of 200 bishops altogether at Trent. 300 from Latin America alone and 200 at Trent. Illustrates quite strikingly how significant the end of colonialism was for the business of the council, and how far apart were the historical settings of the two councils. Historical settings matter. In 1054, the churches of East and West divided dramatically. In 1053, Pope Leo IX had held a synod in Sicily and appointed a bishop there. This greatly angered the Patriarch of Constantinople, because Sicily was theoretically under his jurisdiction and had been so since the 6th century. The Patriarch, in 1053, the Patriarch Michael Cerularius, in retaliation, shut all the Latin Rite churches in his city and attacked the Latin use of unleavened bread for the communion wafer. The French Cardinal, Humbert of Silva Candida, that was his name, it means white forest. The French Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida wrote a defense of unleavened bread, then, rather undiplomatically, was sent by Leo to Constantinople to negotiate a settlement. It was a disaster. There were long drawn-out acrimonious exchanges which came to nothing, ending with Humbert excommunicating the Patriarch and the Patriarch excommunicating the Pope. Despite efforts largely by the papacy, there has never been a complete reconciliation. So there are only 7 councils of the undivided Church, ranging from the First Council of Nicaea in 325 to the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. These are unequivocally ecumenical councils. The ones that followed are also regarded by the Roman Catholic Church as juridically ecumenical, but in order to distinguish them, are often called by historians general councils, ranging from the First Lateran Council in 1123 down to the Second Vatican Council of 1962 to 65. In total, there are 13 of them. This distinction between the ecumenical, meaning universalis in Latin, and general councils was actually made by the Council of Constance in 1415. But what it meant by this has not been explained. As I've just remarked, the first in the official list of ecumenical councils in AD 325 was the Council of Nicaea. But I would like to introduce you to a council that's never made it into the big time. The 314 Council of Arles. I want to mention it, not least because among the 30 bishops or prelates that are turned up, it was attended by 3 British bishops, those of London, York, and probably Lincoln, who were assisted by a priest and a deacon. They also had to beg money for their journey back home. Typical austerity. The council was summoned to deal with what one might call a little local difficulty, the rise of Donatism in North Africa. Historians have written screeds on Donatism, so I don't have to. It was a hot topic when I was an undergraduate, largely, I suspect, because Donatism lent itself to sociological analysis, then a fairly new phenomenon in the study of history. The Emperor Constantine, not yet strictly speaking a Christian, was disturbed by this new heresy because it was disrupting the religious unity he was attempting to impose upon his dominions. And that's the first lesson to take away from the Council of Arles. Church councils have frequently been summoned to restore religious unity within the empire. It was true at Arles, it was true at Nicaea against the Arians, it was true at Chalcedon in 451 when debates about the nature of Christ, begun at Ephesus in 431, threatened to divide the empire east and west, and to some extent is succeeded in doing so. 1,000 years later, the Emperor Sigismund, strictly speaking at the time we're talking about in 1415, he was the king of the Romans, not yet was the heir to the imperial title. Sigismund was faced with different parts of the Holy Roman Empire supporting different claimants to the papal throne, and insisted that John the 23rd, yes, John the 23rd, call the Council of Constance. This took place between 1415 and 1418. Move forward another century and we have the Emperor Charles V putting pressure on a series of reluctant popes to call a council to reconcile Catholics and Protestants, which were effectively at war in his German states. The Council of Trent met in several extended sessions between 1545 and 1563 without achieving the purpose for which it had been called, though it enacted a great number of extremely important reforms while reinforcing Catholic doctrine against the Protestants. So the second lesson to take away from the example of Arles is that despite what canon law says and what the Church would have you believe, councils have not always been called by the Pope. Far from it. And not only have they been called by the Emperor of the day, the Emperor has often presided, either in person or through his representatives. And at least the earliest councils were run as if they were meetings of the Roman Senate. It has only been after Lateran I in 1123, which, as its name indicates, took place in the Basilica of St. John Lateran, that being the Cathedral Church of Rome, of course, that the Bishop of Rome could assert authority over them. And even then, as we shall see, not always completely so. The third lesson, then, is that they have often, perhaps more often than not, been called to restore unity in the faith. And the fourth lesson to be learned is that while they may have been called to restore unity, they have, again, perhaps more often than not, failed in that purpose. Indeed, sometimes even engendered division where there was none before. Neither Vatican I nor Vatican II were called to restore church unity or to settle dogmatic disputes, which actually makes them rather outliers in the history of councils. But nonetheless, they both left division in their wake. In the case of Vatican II, the Society of St. Pius X, as the Lefebvrist schismatics are known, I perhaps should add in parentheses, as it were, the actual schism was occasioned not strictly speaking by matters of belief, but by discipline, by an episcopal consecration as bishops of 4 of the Society's priests against the express will of Rome. Pope Benedict XVI lifted their automatic excommunication, thereby restoring to good standing in the Church, among others, the British national Richard Williamson, who was a Holocaust denier. He later, I'm happy to say, incurred a fresh communication. The case of Vatican I is rather more complicated. It led to an expansion of the old Catholic Church, which was based upon the Diocese of Utrecht, that had been in existence since the early years of the 18th century. The Old Catholics, after Vatican I, the Old Catholics were joined by Ignaz von Göringer, a friend of Newman's, and the most famous church historian of the day. He organized conferences to bring together several churches who called themselves Old Catholics, which were opposed to the declaration of papal infallibility at Vatican I. The Church of England is in communion with the Old Catholics of Utrecht, which has, according to current rather monastic Roman Catholic theology of ordination, valid, if not licit, orders. In 1930, 2 Old Catholic bishops were invited to join in the consecration of some Anglican bishops, thereby handing on to anyone ordained by these bishops valid Catholic orders. This is known in the C of E as the Dutch touch. While you might think I digress, what I'm attempting to demonstrate is that decisions made long ago in these councils may have modern-day consequences. To take another example, at Mass we say what is known as the Nicene Creed, a creed, in other words, which purports to be statement of the Christian faith as formulated at the Council of Nicaea in 325, except that it wasn't. The form of words that we say comes from the Council of Constantinople in 381, and the Council of Ephesus of 431 forbade any changes being made to it. In the Western Church, however, we have made a change. The words "and from the Son" have been added, a phrase known, of course, as the filioque and the Son. This seriously upset the Eastern churches, not that they don't agree with the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father and the Son, but they object to the words being added in direct contravention of the decrees of the Council of Ephesus. The filioque apart, the creed was formulated in such a way, light from light, true God from true God, consubstantial with the Father, and so on, so as to utterly reject Arianism. And there aren't too many Arians around these days. It seems a bit unnecessary to keep reminding us of a 4th century controversy. Some of the things decided at councils remain rather more relevant. It was the 4th Council of the Lateran in 1215, for example, that instructed that the Eucharist be kept in a tabernacle, that it should be made secure by locking it, and that the faithful should receive the Eucharist at least once a year, and that at Easter or thereabouts, as we used to say in the Catechism. There was also, among the 71 instructions of 4th Lateran, one that would distress the heart of the HMRC. Namely, it said, Lateran, tithes, that is to say money paid to the church, had priority over state taxes. There was also at Lateran 4 the customary condemnation of heretics, though none was specifically mentioned. We condemn all heretics, said the Council, whatever names they may go under. They had different faces indeed, but their tails are tied together. Lateran 4, held under the greatest of medieval popes, Innocent III, was therefore a reforming council rather than a dogmatic one. But councils commonly deal both with heresy and with reform. That was particularly true of the Council of Trent, which undertook important doctrinal work on, for instance, the relation between nature and grace, but also pari passu, at least in theory, dealt with reform. For instance, reform of the clergy, ordering the establishment of seminaries so that priests could be properly educated in theology. I have called the outcome of the councils instructions, but they are usually known as decrees, or more technically, canons. A canon is something which is meant to be unchanging. That's the meaning of it in Greek. For instance, the canon of Scripture, the list of biblical books which contain the authentic Word of God, though the definition, what was included in the canon of Scripture, was not settled until the Council of Trent, until the 16th century. As I have just remarked, councils have dealt with two sorts of issues, theological and disciplinary. The former, the theological issues, were certainly meant to be unchanging. The latter, the disciplinary questions, for instance, how the liturgy should be celebrated or how the clergy should dress, are clearly not unchanging. Vatican II did not itself produce any canons, but canons have been drawn from it and included in the Code of Canon Law. One might not unreasonably assume that canons included in the Code have all been enacted by ecumenical councils. That's certainly not the case. The Code of Canon Law was only produced for the first time in 1917, the codification being treated with suspicion by many in the Church, because it was too redolent of the Napoleonic Code, one of the outcomes of the hated French Revolution. The Code of Canon Law was drawn, in fact, from the Corpus Juris Canonici, the body of canon law. Before the 12th century, church lawyers, looking for precedents, drew upon a whole range of sources, earlier councils, even the decisions of local bishops. The result was that there were a good many canons which contradicted one another, a lawyer therefore being able to choose the one which most suited him. To solve this problem, to make sense of the contradiction, in the early 12th century, a lawyer called Gratian, thought to have been a Camaldolese monk, put together a book entitled Concordantia Discordantium Canonum, a concordance of discordant canons, but known to subsequent generations of lawyers, of jurists, as the Decretum Gratianum. This was the first in a series of collections of canon law books, still including the decisions of local councils, as well as including the decisions of ecumenical councils. And this collection of books came to be known as the Corpus Juris Canonici. Given that there are all these law books containing the decisions of councils, ecumenical and otherwise, how does a theologian or a canon lawyer find his way around all this morass of decisions? For a theologian, the answer is a small or fairly small book called the Anchoridian Symbolorum Definitionem et Declarationem de Rebus Fidei Morum. This is a handbook, that is the meaning of Anchoridian, of all the basic texts of Catholic dogma and morality that have been updated. It is updated regularly. It is usually referred to as Denzinger after its first editor. The canons are quoted in their original language, though those not in Latin are provided with a Latin translation. It is important to read the original text. A recent contretemps between Clifford Longley and myself in the page of the tablet turned on the meaning of a Latin term in a papal encyclical. Now I have here to show you what this looks like. There we are. The Anchoridian Symbolorum. Symbolorum means creed, of definitions and of declarations on things of faith and morals. Like that. It's a standard book for any student of theology, Catholic student of theology. What they were all drawn from, the ecumenical councils, is a book that is well known to one of your members here because he published it. This is one of two volumes. I didn't want to carry them both because it's just too heavy. This is Latin and English, again organized by Norman Tanner, taken from the original Italian Latin version by a man called Alberigo, on the decrees of the ecumenical councils. Perhaps people might like to see that one. Published by Sheed and Ward at Georgetown in the States, at £100, as I recall. I got it free. Now, I want to finish this talk by first having a look at what Newman had to say about the councils. This is, after all, the Newman Association. And then secondly, say something more about one of the most controversial councils in the history of the Church, the Council of Constance. One of the mainsprings of Newman's conversion was his understanding of a remark by St. Augustine writing against the Donatists again, securus judicat orbis terrarum. The whole world judges safely, securely, which was very similar to what was expressed a few decades later by St. Vincent of Lerins, that the criterion of Catholic doctrine was quod ubique, quod semper, quod ab omnibus creditum est, what is believed everywhere, always, and by all. Newman was once asked by an Anglican lady what the expression securus judicat meant. He replied, "The Christian commonwealth is one organized body, but from time to time local disturbances arise in it. Branches rise up separately from the rest and claim to be heard in matters of discipline or doctrine, that the Christian state, the commonwealth, the kingdom, securus judicat, has the right, the power, the certitude of deciding the rights and wrongs of the matter." He wrote this, and rather more, because I've abbreviated it, to a Mrs. Helbert on the eve of the First Vatican Council. He apparently believed that the councils should only be called when there was a serious theological issue to decide. As we have seen, that historically that is not the case. Secondly, he seems to be saying, and more obviously elsewhere than in my short quote, that whether Pius IX was the true pope, or whether a council was a true expression of the Catholic faith, securus judicat orbis terrarum, the people will decide. This sounds very like Gallicanism, the theory, that is to say, that anything emanating from the Vatican, before it becomes binding on the consciences, has to be approved, although nowadays the usual expression is received by the local church. Newman's theory was expressly ruled out by the definition of papal infallibility. Papal declarations on faith and morals are infallible, said the Council, ex sese et non et consensu ecclesiae. That is to say, they're infallible of themselves, and not because people agree with them. This might sound rather Dicronian, putting too much authority in the hands of the Pope. But the definition of infallibility was carefully phrased, limiting the Pope's freedom of action to certain very limited situations, a fact frequently forgotten by commentators both in the Church and outside it. And in any case, it was presumed that before any infallible statement were to be made, the Pontiff would have discovered what was the belief of the Church, as Pope Pius IX claimed to have done before the proclamation of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception in 1854. However, when talking about the councils of the Church, the elephant in the papal chamber is the 1415 Council of Constance. And if anything needs to be put in its historical context, it is the Council of Constance. The story really begins 100 years before the council met. In 1309, the French Pope Clement V, who was rather under the thumb of King Philip the Fair of France, settled the papal court in Avignon, which was technically papal territory, but obviously, then as now, in the southwest of France. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI was persuaded to return to Rome, but then died the following year. The conclave which followed was undoubtedly much influenced by a Roman mob determined that Rome needed a Roman pope. The man who was hurriedly chosen by the cardinal electors took the name Urban VI. Pope Urban proved in the end to be a very difficult person to get on with, and the outraged French cardinals claimed that Urban had not been canonically elected because the pressure from the Roman mob meant that the electors were acting under duress. So the French cardinals proceeded to a new election, and Clement VII was chosen, Robert of Geneva, who promptly moved back to Avignon with his entourage, the beginning of what is known as the Great Western Schism. Now there were two popes, two papal courts, two sets of cardinals. Europe was divided. England backed the Pope of the Roman obedience, for instance, while Scotland, as a consequence, and quite naturally, supported the Avignon claimant. Clearly, this was not a satisfactory situation. In 1409, the cardinals of the two obediences, they were called, the obedience of Avignon and of Rome, the two cardinals of the two obedience agreed to meet in Pisa and elect a new pope to bring both of them together. This they did. Unfortunately, the two already in post did not take the hint and resign. So there were now three popes, three claimants to the papal throne. This was when Sigismund, king of the Romans, intervened. He pressured the Pope, John the 23rd, to call a council at Constance, which he did. But after the council had been in session, it became clear to Pope John, that his claims to the papal throne were not going to be upheld, and so he fled the country. He was eventually arrested and brought back. But in the meantime, the Council Fathers had issued a decree entitled, from its opening words, Haec Sancta Synodus, this Holy Council, unequivocally asserting the superiority of a council over the Pope, a theory that had been gaining momentum from the 14th century and is known as conciliarism. The decree, Haec Sancta, opens with the words, legitimately assembled in the Holy Spirit, constituting a general council and representing the Catholic Church militant, it has power immediately from Christ, and everyone of whatever state or dignity, even papal, is bound to obey it in those matters which pertain to the faith, the eradication of the said schism, and the general reform of the said Church of God in head and members. As if this wasn't enough, the council went on to issue a decree frequent, obliging whoever was going to be the next elected pope to hold councils of the church at regular intervals. The first to occur 5 years after Constance, the next 7 years after that, and from then on, every 10 years. Haec Sancta and Frequens, if anyone's looked them up, are not to be found in the Anchoridian that I have passed around, because they're not regarded by Rome as legitimate. And Constance, in the first instance, had been called by a Pisan pope, which is why the Romans didn't like it. The Roman Pope, Gregory XII, insisted on calling the council again, which was by this time well underway. But the two controversial decrees, having been passed before Gregory XII's convocation of the council, have therefore been regarded by the Roman Church as non-binding. But this wrangle lay in the future. More immediately, the council next set about deposing all claimants, including Gregory, and electing yet another new pope. Given the controversy about the status of the Pope Emeritus, I thought I might say a few words about what happened to the popes dismissed by the Council of Constance. John the 23rd, who was found guilty of gross misconduct, which was actually before his papal office, he'd been a pirate. John the 23rd was found guilty of gross misconduct, which he did not deny, was imprisoned for 3 years, and then bought his freedom with money provided by the Medici. He therefore fled to Florence and was later appointed Cardinal Bishop of Tusculum, which is Frascati. He died shortly after arriving in Florence, and at the expense of the Medici was buried in a splendid tomb emblazoned with the papal insignical. That really upset the newly elected Pope. It's agenda for Olim Papa on the thing. Don't know if you can see it, actually. I've never looked. Gregory XIII, the Roman Pope, was appointed Cardinal Bishop of Porto and given precedence immediately after the Pope, but he too died soon afterwards. The Aragonese Pope, Benedict XIII, however, would not go quietly. Though deposed by the council, he created a new papal court at the Castle of Peniscola on the coast near Valencia, where he appointed more cardinals, who in turn elected a new pope on Benedict's death, and so it went on. But to return to Constance. After deposing the three claimants to the papal title, the council had to elect someone in their place. The election of this new pope, however, was not done by the cardinals. Not by the cardinals as such, but by the council fathers themselves. Most councils have been constituted almost entirely by bishops, but this was not true of Constance. There were, of course, cardinals and bishops and heads of religious orders, but that included the military religious orders, whose masters were definitely not clergy. But there were also professors of theology and canon law, other representatives of the university, and a large number of members of the nobility, especially the nobility of the Holy Roman Empire. In other words, there were present at Constance a large number of laymen. It had long been the view that if a pope died during a council, then that council should elect his successor rather than the cardinals. But how to do this? It was eventually agreed at Constance that the electors should represent the 5 nations: England, France, Italy, Spain, and Germany, though Germany embraced other countries such as Poland and Hungary, into which the council fathers were divided. Representatives of each of these nations should vote in a conclave separately, and they should choose a candidate by the 2/3 of the votes like the cardinals did. And that cumbersome procedure finally settled on Cardinal Odo of the ancient Roman Colonna family, who took the title Martin V. Martin confirmed the decrees of Constance, though not frequens and haec sancta. Martin confirmed the decrees of the Council of Constance, and so did Pope Eugenius IV, who succeeded Martin. Not surprisingly, popes had never been happy with the limitations on their authority, as implied in haec sancta, which is one of the reasons why, despite pressure from the Emperor Charles V, the Renaissance popes were reluctant to call what became eventually the Council of Trent after the rise of Protestantism. And it is abundantly obvious the provisions of haec sancta and of frequens enacted by the Council of Constance are difficult, indeed impossible, to reconcile with the decrees on papal infallibility of Vatican I. The question therefore remains: is synodality, the involvement of all Catholics in the governance of the Church that is now being promoted by Pope Francis, simply a new name for conciliarism? Discuss.